Hello. Hey.
Just one question.
Yeah.
I was trying during the weekend and today as well to download the papers
Yeah.
that you, but it, I just can't open, neither open nor download them. I don't know why.
That's really weird.
Yes.
Let's try the break again. Because I've
Okay.
never seen
Sure.
that on it.
Oh,
So.
yeah, no worries.
All right. Hey, how are you? Yeah, good. Yeah, it's good. Yay. All right. And All right. Good evening, everyone. Apologies for the late start. Took a wrong turn out of the station and ended up taking 20 minutes instead of 5. So, in any event, we've all made it here. So, let's get started. First, any questions leading on from last week's class or last week's tutorials? All right. Well, what we're going to move on to today is money and payment. Clearly a key aspect of international commerce. And what I want to do is I want to pick up a couple of news stories on points that we've looked at over the past weeks, then move on into the money and payment topic. The first is on a subject we spent some time on in the tutorials, and it's really these first two articles, which are about multipolarization of trade and commerce. And this is a story about the direction we're seeing in terms of global trends from the standpoint of commercial transactions. And the key piece, and it's really this second paragraph, governments, companies, and even many individuals are not standing still. Instead, they retaliated in a smarter way, reducing their future reliance on a U.S. that has increasingly embraced protectionism. And so the trend that we're seeing is very much a direction away from trade centered on the U.S. And as we discussed in the tutorials last week, rather than having that traditional hub and spoke arrangement, we're seeing increasing trade, both with new hubs like China, but also increasingly between the spokes as well. Many of those other nations are trading more with each other and relatively less with the U.S. Last year, Indian exports to China, the Middle East, and North Africa increased even as high U.S. tariffs weighed on sales in America. Brazil, Chile, Argentina, and Peru enjoyed record exports, owed again mainly to increased trade with China and the rest of the world. Sure, ASEAN nations continue to send big volumes to America, but often as part of an Asian supply chain that depends on Chinese inputs and investment. Today, commerce among developing nations, particularly in East Asia and Africa, drives global trade growth, while North America and, to a lesser extent, Europe stagnate. And so I think this has been one of the key themes, and I just wanted to flag this. I also wanted to flag one more story on this point, which relates, there we go. China pledges zero tariffs for 53 African nations as trade volumes hit record highs. This is a recent announcement in a message sent Saturday to the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa. Xi Jinping said the blanket zero tariff policy would take effect May 1st for all countries that have diplomatic relations with China. Beijing's announcement coincides with fresh data showing commercial ties have deepened despite global economic headwinds. China, Africa's largest trading partner for 16 consecutive years, saw total trade with the continent surge 17.8% in the first 11 months of 2025 to $3.14 billion, surpassing the full year total for 2024. However, And this is back to a bit of that hub and spoke relationship that we talked about traditionally. The relationship remains heavily unbalanced. Chinese exports to Africa jumped 26% during the period, while imports from Africa grew a modest 5.2%. The zero tariff policy is widely viewed as a mechanism to address this surplus by encouraging agricultural and industrial exports. And so this, once again, is one of those points around multipolarization of trade and commercial relationships. Two more, and then we'll switch to payments. First, not going to work. For some reason, the FT subscription never works here. So, I'm going to pick up this. Nope, not that one. Very strange. All right. Downside of using storage. Let's do it this way. Google. AI memory chip. Okay. Okay. This is a story that we've seen repeatedly, which is on a key input into many different supply chains. And this is around semiconductors, around chips, but it's also around something that we focus less on, which relates to that, which is memory. In other words, in order for those GPUs to work, one actually needs a significant amount of memory to go with them. And the story that we're seeing is that essentially the demand from AI companies for data centers, as we've seen, is pushing up the prices of GPUs. But they're also pushing up the price of other inputs like memory. And those increases in memory costs are starting to have major implications across a wide range of other uses. A growing procession of tech industry leaders, including Elon Musk and Tim Cook, are warning about a global crisis in the making. A shortage of memory chips is beginning to hammer profits, derail corporate plans, and inflate price tags on everything from laptops and smartphones to automobiles and data centers. And the crunch is only going to get worse. Since the start of 2026, Tesla, Apple, and a dozen other major corporations have signaled that the shortage of DRAM, or dynamic random access memory, the fundamental building block of almost all technology, will constrain productions. Cook warned it will compress iPhone margins. Micron Technology, a major producer, called the bottleneck unprecedented. Musk got to the intractable nature of the problem when he declared Tesla is going to have to build its own memory fabrication plant. The fundamental reason for the squeeze is the build out of AI data centers. Companies like Alphabet and OpenAI are gobbling up an increasing share of memory chip production by buying millions of NVIDIA AI accelerators that come with huge allotments of memory to run their chatbots and other applications. That's left consumer electronics producers fighting over a dwindling supply of chips from the likes of Samsung and Micron. The resulting price spikes are starting to look a bit like the Weimar Republic's hyperinflation. The cost of one type of DRAM soared from December to January 75%, accelerating price hikes throughout the holiday quarter. A growing number of retailers and middlemen are changing their prices every day. We stand at the cusp of something that is bigger than anything we faced before. What is ahead of us between now and the end of the decade in terms of demand is bigger than anything we've seen in the past. Now, look at this. This, I think, is an interesting chart. One new NVIDIA AI chip requires as much memory as several powerful PCs. In other words, typically if I look around and I see quite a lot of Apple laptops, a few HPs, my guess is that most of you will have probably around 16 gigabytes of RAM in those laptops. Now, that right there is this little orange. One NVIDIA chip requires 300 gigabytes. Now, if one is operating a system where one is running hundreds of thousands of chips, each chip demanding hundreds of gigabytes of memory to go with it in order to operate, and the fact that if you think about who has the most money to spend right now on memory, it's the AI companies. So in other words, the AI companies are, because they have the resources, because they view that there is the huge transformational opportunity, they are bidding up prices for the RAM as well as the memory chips that go into a wide range of applications. And what that means is that basically anything else that uses memory, which is almost any form of electronic good, that the price is starting to go up and may well go up pretty dramatically. What's worrying about the trend is that prices are soaring and supplies are running dry even before the AI giants really get going with their data construction plans. Alphabet and Amazon just announced plans for a construction blitz this year that could reach $185 billion and $200 billion respectively, more money than any company in history has poured into capital expenditures in a single year. This structural imbalance between supply and demand is not simply a short-term fluctuation. So what we can see is prices, not surprisingly, starting to go up dramatically as a result of demand and supply constraints. The disruption is threatening the profitability of entire product lines and upending long-term plans. Sony Corp is now considering pushing back the debut of its next PlayStation, according to people familiar with the company's thinking. That would be a major upset to a carefully orchestrated strategy. Close rival Nintendo is also contemplating raising the price of its device in 2026. A manager at a laptop maker said Samsung Electronics has recently begun reviewing its memory supply contracts every quarter or so versus generally on an annual basis. So note this point. We've talked repeatedly about supply chain structures. We've talked about the differences between instant, a single transaction, and what we often find in supply chains, which is an assumption that a transaction will be on a repeat basis. Now, this is interesting because Samsung, as one of our major suppliers of memory chips, the point here is that until this year, they generally would have structured their supply contracts with buyers on an annual basis. In other words, if you were an electronics manufacturer, you were buying a year's supply, that supply would arrive as you needed it. Typically, that would be the manufacturing model. You would have those terms locked in for a year. As a result of changes, we're now seeing Samsung, as the major supplier, reduce the length of those contracts with purchasers to quarterly, enabling it both to reset prices, but also, because it may face supply constraints, to restructure supply that will go. So in other words, this is one of those aspects where when one is putting together something like a car or a laptop or a smart refrigerator, just about anything today will have this sort of component in its supply chain. And one would like as much predictability in the context of these core components and their pricing as possible. And these supply and demand factors are pushing that up. This is a funny one. At Sunan Plaza, the do-it-yourself PC mecca in Seoul in South Korea, the usual weekday buzz has evaporated. The labyrinth of stalls, once a high-energy hub for gaming graphic cards and motherboards, is now engulfed in an eerie quiet. It's actually wiser to hold off doing business today, as prices are almost certain to be higher tomorrow, said Young-won, who runs 3 DIPC shops in Seoul and frequently does business with stalls in Sunan Plaza. In other words, the simple expectation of higher prices tomorrow for sellers means, why sell today if you can wait and sell tomorrow for a higher price? And that is a real challenge from the standpoint of producers looking to lock in prices. So this, as I said, is one of those stories that has been developing across the semester. Now, back to payment. Key framework in thinking about money and payment. Start once again, as we did so far throughout the course, with the idea around your instantaneous transaction. But in a cross-border transaction, even in an instantaneous transaction, there is at least one question that is not always obvious. And that is, what are you going to pay with? In other words, in a domestic context, if you are doing a transaction in the UK, the assumption will be that you use the monetary instrument, the currency of the country you're in. But if we're talking about a cross-border transaction, that immediately becomes a question. What is the currency that you're actually going to be using? And this is one that, if we think about it over a long period of time, has had a wide variety of different answers. But if we look at the period from the end of the Second World War up to the present, the most common currency for payment in cross-border transactions has been the US dollar. This is something that actually makes life a lot easier. In other words, if we have a default unit of account, means of exchange that we can use to agree the price of a transaction, that makes life a lot easier. And in cross-border transactions, over the past several thousand years, at any given point in time, we have used a variety of different alternatives. Certainly, if we think from around the 16th to the 19th century, the single most common monetary instrument in international trade, Spanish silver dollars. Spain would produce the things, dig them up in Mexico and Peru, have them minted, and ship them to North America, Europe, and the Philippines for transactions really all across the world. And certainly in much of the world, up until in East Asia, the beginning of the 20th century, Spanish silver dollars would be the dominant monetary instrument. In other periods, we've seen others. In the context of the primary Islamic period, we see the Islamic dinar widely used. We see in the context of Rome, the Roman denarius. We see a variety of choices in earlier periods. These are all metallic. We also see in certain other contexts paper instruments. One of the most interesting is in the context of the Mongol Empire, the ability to use paper monetary instruments, which could be used really from one end of the empire to another to make transactions simpler. Now, the reason why this question is interesting today is we are seeing an increasing use in commercial transactions of a range of other currencies in addition to the dollar. It's certainly been the case for a long period of time that a substantial amount of commerce with the EU is actually invoiced in euros. That's quite common. Similarly, Japan, in some circumstances, yen transactions have been common. We're seeing a move, particularly over the past 5 or 6 years, from Chinese sellers to sell more frequently in Chinese yuan. And as a result, this question of choice of monetary instrument is one that is arising more and more. Dollar still very much dominating volumes, but we are seeing an increasing use of a range of others. So the money point, particularly in an international commercial transaction, is not necessarily immediately obvious. This, in many cases, will today actually form a discussion point. It will have a relationship particularly to where the two parties are from, and also if there is an assumption of continuing business, particularly if those business intentions are bilateral. And that means that the payment instrument of one party may be usable more frequently. Now, even once one moves from that simple question, as we flagged previously, the question then becomes one of the actual mechanism of making the payment. And this is something that 20 years ago, the assumption would have been in most cases that this would entail some form of bank transfer. Now, that bank transfer may be part of a more complicated transaction like a letter of credit, but the assumption would have been that the actual payment transfer would go from one bank to another bank as part of the process. And the system of relationships between banks, what we think of as correspondent banking, the relations between different banks in different jurisdictions have been central to this process. Today, however, we are seeing a variety of other mechanisms which are being used. Certainly, we do see the use in some cases of cryptocurrencies, but the challenge with cryptocurrencies is that values are often highly volatile, and that makes it difficult from the standpoint of predictability, particularly in ongoing transactions. We're seeing an increasing use as a result of instruments called stablecoins. One of our most common structures today in many aspects of cross-border payment, whether individual or commercial, is to use a stablecoin, typically via a major provider like Tether, or increasing popularity, Circle. In other words, one of the complexities involved in making a transfer from one jurisdiction to the other are often regulatory issues around things like capital controls, taxation, etc. And in many cases, there are certain attractions to parties to be able to have, for instance, both parties have an account with Circle in a major jurisdiction, and to be able to do simply a transfer between those accounts without necessarily involving at all the monetary or payment system of either of the two domestic jurisdictions. Certainly very common in many transactions to see mechanisms like credit cards. The Visa, MasterCard, China Union Pay network. These are global networks which have been developed since the late 1950s to make it easier to make transactions, and in particular to make cross-border transactions. One can also think about PayPal as a very popular structure. We're seeing a variety of others. And what this means is that now, from the standpoint of the question of money and payment, it may be more frequent than not to say that yes, payment will take place in US dollars via a letter of credit structured between your bank and my bank. That may be the most common structure. But we're now seeing increasing choice available both in the context of the monetary instrument, the currency, as well as in the payment mechanism that goes with the transfer of that currency. And if we want to look at one aspect has been technological transformation of money and payment systems. And this is something that many of us focus on in the context of things like Bitcoin or stablecoins. But just as importantly, we've had major transformations in the context of things like fast payment systems and other traditional mechanisms. We'll come back to those in just a minute. For looking at international arrangements, one of our starting points when we start to think about a bank-to-bank transaction is what is called SWIFT. And this is an organization that, if we think about it, is similar or related in some ways to the various sorts of standard-setting processes which we've seen. So let me pull up SWIFT. So, SWIFT. SWIFT is an organization that is frequently subject these days of criticism from all sorts of different directions. What is it? Its name, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Fund Transfers. In other words, it's an organization established under the laws of Belgium, which is effectively a cooperative amongst most of the world's major banks. Essentially, what it does is it sets standards for electronic transfers. In other words, you have your bank in Brazil, I have my bank in Hong Kong. We would like to make a simple transfer from my bank in Hong Kong to your bank in Brazil. Now, one of the challenges is that historically, each bank would have had its own system of naming and numbering accounts. And that then makes it difficult, because if I ask for your account with your bank, and I give that to my bank, the information that you've given me doesn't necessarily relate to the systems that my bank has. And so, SWIFT essentially establishes standards for interbank transfers. In other words, how accounts are labeled, how banks are labeled, how currencies are labeled, so that one is easily able to make a transfer electronically from one bank, particularly one SWIFT member, to another. And most of you would have seen, in the context of cross-border bank transactions, a request for a SWIFT code. A SWIFT code will be a code that relates to a specific bank, typically a specific branch of that specific bank, which is then used to route transactions. But actually, SWIFT goes one step further. It's not just a system for standardization of information about transfers and accounts. It's also a communications system. In other words, it is a communications network between its member financial institutions. And so, as part of a transfer, for instance, I direct my bank in Hong Kong to transfer money to your bank in Brazil. Part of that process will involve communication between the two banks. And the SWIFT system provides a communications network that is secure, efficient, low cost for enabling those transactions. SWIFT does not actually transfer money. In other words, the message from my bank in Hong Kong to your bank in Brazil via SWIFT is to say that an instruction has been made to transfer money from an account in Hong Kong to an account in Brazil. Now, we often think, in the context of payment transactions, that a payment involves moving money from one place to another. In other words, if we think about an instantaneous transaction where I give you gold coins or a stack of notes, I am physically transferring that monetary instrument. But in the context of a bank-to-bank payment, that is generally not the situation. Now, let's assume that I'm making that transfer in US dollars. So in other words, I have in my account in Hong Kong dollars. The Hong Kong bank will sell sufficient Hong Kong dollars to buy the amount of US dollars that need to be made for the transaction. A communication will go from my bank in Hong Kong to the bank in Brazil. That will highlight that the transfer is going to take place. But from the standpoint of the actual mechanics, US dollars are actually issued by the US Central Bank, the Federal Reserve. So if we are talking about a digital transfer of US dollars, what we are actually talking about is a debiting of the US dollar account of my bank in Hong Kong of its branch in New York. And a parallel crediting of the account of your Brazilian bank in New York. It will then credit your account at the Brazilian branch or the Brazilian headquarters of that bank. And if you want to have it in real or instead of dollars, it will sell the dollars to buy Brazilian real. The end result is that, in fact, US dollars have not moved from Hong Kong to Brazil. In fact, what has actually happened is a debit transaction, a reduction in the balance of the branch of my Hong Kong bank in New York, a crediting of the US dollar balance of your Brazilian bank in New York, and therefore a crediting of the account at the Brazilian bank in Brazil. SWIFT thus doesn't actually transfer anything. It's simply a messaging service that says this instruction has been placed, look for it to happen, these steps need to take place. Now, I've simplified it a bit because in many cases, when we are talking about international banking, we are actually talking about institutions that will have multiple locations, and for larger banks in just about any jurisdiction, they will tend to have either access directly to the US dollar payment system via an office or a branch in New York, or they will have a relationship with what we call a corresponding bank. In other words, there are a small number of banks that actually do the vast majority of the world's cross-border payments. I'm just going to find this one real quick because it's... Now, give me just 1 second. Where's that? Come on, you. Yep. All right, so just as an example, this is the annual results for HSBC for 2023. And a couple of things that I think are interesting. The key one that I want to pull out is this. Electronic payments processed in 2023, 500 trillion US dollars. Now, what's interesting is HSBC in 2023 was the third largest payments bank in the world. In other words, two banks in 2023 did more than $500 trillion of payments. So, very frequently, when we actually talk about the reality of cross-border transactions, in many cases, the transaction will actually go via one of a small number of very large banks who are located in a wide range of jurisdictions. HSBC is one. Thoughts on a couple of others? Citi. Citi's located everywhere. Citi is the largest. They're typically number one for cross-border payments. They do close to, and this is a number you won't hear very often, close to $1 quadrillion in payments a year. That's the largest. HSBC is typically second or third. We've got somewhere around there, big Euro payment bank. Standard Chartered's British, they do a lot of euros, but BNP Paribas. BNP Paribas typically does around 500 trillion, similar to HSBC. Big Chinese bank. Yeah, that's an easy one. Bank of China, similar size. Standard Chartered is another one of the top 5 in terms of cross-border transactions. You might find JP Morgan, Deutsche Bank, somewhere in the next 5 or so. But you've got a small number of banks which typically specialize in one or more of the world's major currencies that tend to provide the network for most transactions. In other words, very frequently, you may have a bank in Brazil which actually has a relationship with HSBC. My bank in Hong Kong actually is HSBC. So if your bank in Brazil, if I'm making a transaction from my account with HSBC to your account in Brazil, very often it's making a long part of that journey inside of HSBC and only crediting the account of your bank in whatever jurisdiction you may be at the last stage of the transaction. Now, contrast this to Bitcoin. Bitcoin is actually a transfer from account to account. And that's a difference. Now, it could be that you actually have an intermediary. In other words, you're doing it via an intermediary like a Binance or a Coinbase, in which case the transaction is actually an internal transaction across the books of Binance or Coinbase. But if you do Bitcoin the old-fashioned way, you've downloaded the system, we both have nodes, we can do a direct transfer from one account to the other, which is much closer to what we think of as a physical transaction. But what we see in the bank-to-bank transfers is not actually a transfer from one place to the other. It's a series of debits and credits across different systems with communication systems like SWIFT central to those processes. Something like Circle is actually trying to be a little bit like HSBC or BNP Paribas, in that they would like to have as large of a volume of the transactions take place across their books as possible. And the end result, however, with a Circle stablecoin transaction is like Bitcoin. It is actually moving from one account to another. So, SWIFT, thus, is the communication system at the heart of these transactions. And if we pick up the SWIFT note, ever since our inception in 1973, we've been helping value get to where it needs to go, quickly, reliably, securely. A globally inclusive cooperative made up of over 11,500 institutions across more than 200 countries and territories. Roughly every 3 days, the world's GDP passes over our network to keep supply chains moving and economies turning. Global GDP today is around 120 trillion US dollars. So that means that every 3 days, about 120 trillion US dollars equivalent is messaged across the SWIFT system. So that's about 40 trillion US dollars a day in the context of messaging. 75% of SWIFT payments reach destination banks within 10 minutes. Our core, globally inclusive infrastructure that the world trusts and relies on to send and receive financial transactions. So in other words, if we go back to our original framework for why we think about international commercial law, SWIFT has evolved as a mechanism, it's an organization, which involves participation from financial institutions primarily in order to facilitate cross-border communication of payments information. We also see, in addition to ISO. So in addition to SWIFT standards and communication systems, we are also seeing the ISO developing a standardized system for other forms of payments. And what we're now seeing in many cases is that the ISO standards are embedded in both SWIFT transactions, but also a range of other payment transactions. In other words, a common payment term may be telegraphic transfer via SWIFT to this SWIFT code. That might be a common, simple payment transaction. We're increasingly seeing a variety of other payment mechanisms used, and those may have payment in accordance with ISO 20022 standards via, it could be CIPS, what is called the China International Payment System, which is a SWIFT type system that focuses on CNY transactions. It could be linking up fast payment systems. We now have a number of projects which are looking to link up domestic instant payment systems. And generally speaking, one would then say payment via Nexus Global Payments under ISO 20022 standards. So payment terms One will always specify the monetary instrument: dollars, gold, Bitcoin, euros, CNY. One will then have specifications around transfer mechanisms. The default, the most common, is going to be something via the SWIFT system to a SWIFT account with a specified bank account in a certain jurisdiction. One may now also have a variety of other sorts of payment choices beyond just those traditional sorts of ISO-based banking, of SWIFT-based banking system. If we look at the SWIFT one, ISO 20022 is a multi-part international standard prepared by ISO Technical Committee TC68 Financial Services. It describes a common platform for the development of messages using a modeling methodology to capture in a syntax-independent way financial business areas, business transactions, and associated message flows. A central dictionary of business items used in financial communications, and a set of code, XML and ASM.1 design rules to convert the message models into XML or ASM1, whether the use is for ISO, XML, etc. So in other words, it is a set of communication standards which can then be embedded into a variety of systems, which makes it easier to make a transfer or a payment from one place to another. It simplifies, it provides standardization, it enhances predictability, it reduces transaction costs. Really strange thing tonight. Now, what I want to do just before we take a short break is pick up two things. First is a story, and I'll circulate the text of this via an announcement so you all have it, because it's an interesting story. It's a story called In-Depth China Lifts the Lid on Multi-Trillion Yuan Corporate IOU Market. And essentially what this is it is a regulatory effort to try to bring some standardization, if you will, and a level of order and trust to the mechanisms that we're seeing an increasing range of Chinese large businesses using from the standpoint of payments. Last year, Chinese regulators began mapping out the opaque market for corporate IOUs that has allowed big-name companies like automaker BYD to defer payments to suppliers on a massive scale, putting strain on the financial health of China's industrial backbone. So, if we think about historically, one of our most common transaction structures, one of our most common payment structures is what is called a promissory note. Promissory note is simply a promise from one party to pay the other. It is, in the common language of this article, an IOU. An IOU simply is a statement that I owe you, that I promise to pay a certain amount, typically on presentation of this note at certain places. So if we want to think about what is one of our very first means of simplifying payments, which evolves, it is to basically be able to create a promissory note. It is basically a note which says the buyer will pay a certain amount on presentment of the note. In many cases, the idea was that you had the piece of paper instead of physical gold or silver. The idea was that you could use the piece of paper and that the receiver of the piece of paper could, at whatever point they wanted, present that piece of paper for the equivalent amount of gold and silver. In many cases, those IOUs, those promissory notes, became tradable in and of themselves. In other words, nobody ever actually took them and presented them for the gold or the silver. Instead, one used the IOU as a monetary instrument. It worked because typically the issuer was a name, someone who was sufficiently known that their notes would be trustworthy and usable in a variety of transactions. Yeah? It's basically the same thing. A promissory note is a technical legal term, which basically says you have to meet certain legal formalities, but it is an IOU. And more or less, if one thinks that an IOU is just a piece of paper that says, I owe X party a certain amount of money payable, a promissory note is exactly the same thing. It's just a technical term as opposed to a colloquial term. So, what's interesting about the Chinese example is that what we've seen evolve in the past several years in China has been similar to what we've seen in other circumstances where IOUs have emerged as a form of payment in the context of transactions. So, this story, as of the end of November, these outstanding IOUs were worth 2.57 trillion yuan, about 370 billion US, according to data released last month, that would be January, by the National Internet Finance Association of China. And that's just from what the state-backed association has managed to tally from platforms that have reported. A total of 244 platforms had filed their basic information with NIFA by the end of December, with 193 submitting data about their operations. So let me highlight how this works. Think BYD. BYD, major automotive company, but you can think about just about any large corporate in China would use a similar system. BYD, to make cars, you need a lot of pieces. BYD doesn't make all the pieces. Generally speaking, they have a supply chain. They get tires, they get seats, they get radios, they get touch screens, they get engines or batteries, depending on what kind of car it is. They buy in all of these pieces from suppliers. Now, how BYD would typically pay its suppliers is it would create a single online system which you as a supplier would have to register with. BYD would then, as you delivered whatever it is you're supposed to deliver, BYD will keep track. You have delivered 50,000 batteries at a certain price. The contract for delivery of those batteries specifies a certain price, and BYD will provide you essentially with an IOU, a promissory note, that says they will pay you in a certain period of time. Now, why is that useful? Well, it's useful for BYD because they're not paying you immediately. They're paying you over time. So they're actually getting you to make them a loan. That's one. But two, from the standpoint of the supplier, the fact that you have the IOU from BYD means that you can actually do business with other BYD suppliers. You need to get certain pieces, inputs into whatever it is you're producing, and you're able to use the BYD IOU as currency in the context of this system for transactions amongst the thousands of different BYD suppliers. So you are able to have some assurance that you will eventually get paid, but you will also have the ability to use that future promise to pay from BYD for a range of other transactions within that online system. BYD, in many cases, is not just trying to extract time from its suppliers, but also the fact that there may be some time in between an agreement between BYD and one of its suppliers for delivery of something. So, as we're going to see with a letter of credit, which is one mechanism, this is a centralized system where BYD will say, all right, you are going to deliver a certain number of components to us at a certain date in future. We will give you a promissory note which says that we will pay at a certain date in future, which we time to match when we expect the delivery of those components. You, as the supplier, can then take that promissory note and use it as a means, potentially, to buy things from other suppliers within that system. The bigger the universe of suppliers and the bigger the buyer, in the case of BYD, the more value those promissory notes are going to have from the standpoint of making payments amongst all of the parties in the BYD system. Now, the view was that by a couple of years ago, Chinese authorities were beginning to gain an understanding of the scale of some of these systems. And of course, it could apply just as easily to foreign suppliers as to domestic suppliers. This is an online system that would allow management by BYD of all of its suppliers, as well as all of its payments. And from the standpoint of the suppliers, it allows those IOUs to be used amongst the transactors. So, we've seen over the past 5 years in particular, a large number of these systems created. And fears from a policy standpoint about what would happen if one of these core companies had financial problems, and what the impact might be on the wider supply chain. And so, around this time last year, we saw the beginning of a new effort to try to regulate and bring some order to this system. So, a total of 244 platforms. So BYD's platform, that would be one platform. By the end of 2025, about 244 platforms had actually filed some sort of information as required. Those 244 platforms were showing 370 billion US dollars equivalent in outstanding IOUs. In other words, each of those 244 platforms had something on average over 10 billion US in IOUs outstanding. So in other words, that's not issued and then have been paid. Those were actually IOUs that were open at that point in time. Now, clearly, some of the suppliers would have had much larger open positions. Others would have been much smaller. The 2.57 trillion yuan figure offers an initial glimpse into the colossal scale of a market that has become subject of a sweeping regulatory campaign spearheaded by the People's Bank of China, China's central bank, and other watchdogs. Their target is the IOUs, officially known as electronic accounts receivable certificates. For years, big companies, including those in China's auto industry, have been using these IOUs to pay suppliers, which could only cash them in at full value if they held on to them for a certain period, typically about 6 months. So in other words, typical payment terms would be 6 months from the initial transaction. If suppliers needed their money faster, they could trade the IOUs for cash, but at a discount to the full value of the certificate. A filing by one of BYD's suppliers, for instance, revealed that it accepted discount rates of 5.2 to 7.2% on its IOUs from the automaker. In other words, if I had an IOU from BYD, I wouldn't necessarily be able to trade it today for full face value. I would have to accept a discount from its official face value in order to use it today. And this is something that, ironically, one will see in the London markets, for instance, across the 18th and the 19th century. You'll see frequent references to discounting bills, bills of exchange. A bill of exchange is effectively a promissory note, but one which is freely transactable because it meets certain specific legal requirements to make it easier to buy and sell that note. And if you are buying and selling it today, there will be, in most cases, a discount to its value. So this system that evolved over the past decade or so in China is an interesting version because it's a newer version of systems which we've seen evolve in other places in other periods. Many big companies set up affiliated companies to issue these IOUs. By May 2023, BYD's Dilian, and that's its electronic certificate platform, had issued over 400 billion yuan, which is around 65 billion US in these IOUs. BYD has become something of a poster child for this issue. The system allowed the automaker to dramatically shift its liability to a type of debt that it didn't have to pay interest on. From 2019, its accounts payable, the amount of money it owed suppliers, skyrocketed. So even though BYD had a relatively high liability to asset ratio of 75% at the end of 2024, according to its annual report, its interest-bearing debt was less than 5% of that. That's because the vast majority of its debt was in interest-free IOUs to its suppliers. You can certainly see the attraction from the standpoint of BYD in this system. But its original origin was essentially just a centralized payment and record-keeping structure. In other words, the idea that a large company has lots of suppliers, the ability to want to be able to keep track of all of those suppliers, to be able to monitor their deliveries and the amounts outstanding, and to begin essentially first giving IOUs for things which had not been delivered, but then over time moving to a default situation where payment would actually be in the form of an IOU for payment some 6 months after the delivery of whatever it might be. And the end result was the raising of concerns from a policy standpoint. But clearly, one can see how this sort of system works not only in a domestic supply chain, but it also works in the context of a cross-border supply chain. And in many ways, it has the advantage from a cross-border standpoint of you're not actually having to make payments in most cases. You're able, as the supplier, to actually transfer the IOU to other participants in the system. This system has worked out well for companies like BYD, but less so for their suppliers. Even for those who can wait to cash in the IOUs at full value, they are effectively bearing the cost of providing an interest-free loan. Suppliers that cash in early have to incur a cost. One construction industry participant complained on social media that turning these digital IOUs into actual money requires navigating a labyrinth of platforms and opening specific bank accounts, with cashing out costing 3 to 5% in discount fees. Big companies didn't just capitalize on the extended payment terms. Many also profited by setting up affiliated companies that bought the discounted IOUs from their suppliers. This practice has grown so common that there's a name for it in China, eating from both ends. This practice of issuing and then buying back IOUs from one's own suppliers has effectively put the big industrial companies involved in the finance business. The regulatory campaign currently underway aims to rein in the practice and bring it under tighter scrutiny. New rules from the State Council implemented in June 2025 require big companies to pay their smaller suppliers within 60 days. Some suppliers have already seen a change. 2 smaller companies told Caixin that BYD has been paying them in cash since late October, which is quite a change. Previously, a typical payment cycle took around 8 months, one of them said. Now, getting paid in 2 or 3 months saves an estimated 400 to 600,000 yuan, so that's around 90 to 100,000 US a year in financing costs. BYD has disbanded the business unit responsible for Dilian, and its affiliated company that once provided financing for suppliers to cash in their IOUs is now largely dormant. Other automakers have taken similar steps. So, essentially, this once again provides a nice example of how systems can evolve to deal with these coordination problems, the standardization, to take in time and distance in order to better manage risks. They also show how very easily, however, large players, and you will see exactly the same thing from a large company like an Apple, for instance. The relationship between Apple and its suppliers is often the same sort of disparity in bargaining power. But this is a nice example of how we are seeing similar mechanisms to what we've seen evolve in other contexts, evolve in new contexts to try to address similar problems. All right, let's take a break. Let's make it, since we're only getting one break, let's make it 15 minutes. So we'll come back at 7:40. now. There's the code. Yeah.
I know, and I've used like this website for
Yeah, but no, now I do non-stop. I don't stop one.
How was your trip? Yeah, it was cool.
Hey, sorry, yeah.
I sent an email today. I've gotten from the PT law that my attendance has fallen short. And
Okay.
I have Monty in that email responding
Yeah, and which
that
I
my
have
two
the-
classes are not made. Yes, so from your end, if you could just update,
I will.
that's an option. Please do that. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Secondly, how thorough the readings have to be there, like the one which is prior to the classes, the one from the books.
You know,
So
it's-
should I like dig into it? And what will be the, and do we need to refer footnotes for the assessment?
If from the standpoint of the weird, so it isn't working on this one either.
So it must be like a website thing.
Yeah, so let me check again because this is
Yeah, no
what I did
worries.
normally, but thank you. That's yeah. The anyway, so with the references at the end, if you cite something or refer to something, then you need to have a reference or citation.
Yes.
It doesn't. I'm pretty agnostic in the context of which system you use, whether you use a footnote or whether you use a sort of bracketed in-text sort of
That's what I
reference.
want to know, like
Yeah,
what
perfectly
do you
fine.
prefer for
No,
assessment?
I'm completely happy with whatever system you prefer.
But it has to be mentioned, right?
It just has to be consistent.
Okay. How about if I refer to the idea of whatever written by the concerned author or jurist, and then I just put up the idea without referring to the concern? Would that cause like
I mean, it's,
probability of receiving a deduction or,
I mean,
or something that's not
but
referenced?
in that case, what you'd probably want to do is at least you'd then have a bibliography,
Okay.
which would then have the full citation.
Okay, and that can be used by the
Yeah.
assessment.
Exactly.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Hey.
So, good evening. I just have a small doubt regarding the ISO 2022 and the SWIFT protocol
Yeah.
that are being taught. So, Professor, there was a case that I was working on in 2025. I'm a practitioner back home in India.
Yeah, yeah.
So, basically, there was this US-based mining company which they had sold a few carbon credits, and they had their operations in Africa.
Yeah.
And the proceeds of those sales were stored in a US bank account,
Yeah.
which was not registered on the SWIFT system.
Yeah.
So they were looking to transfer these accounts using the KTT protocols or the ISO 2022 protocols. Now, at that point in my life, I was new to this concept.
It's fairly unusual.
Yes,
So,
yeah, very, yes. So they were looking to transfer these proceeds using an intermediary account.
Yeah.
So how does one help the client navigate through these complex transactions, avoiding AML PML protocols to multi-party
Yeah, I
transactions?
mean, generally what you would do in those circumstances, the key would be, say, having where the payment has to go
Right.
and how it has to get there. You don't necessarily have to say how it gets from the payor's account.
Right.
The payor has a responsibility of figuring out how to get it
That's correct.
with
Yes.
the terms in the contract.
Of course, yes.
Yeah.
So, no, but there are sometimes, for example, they were not registered on SWIFT, and they were using an intermediary that had ISO 2020022
Yeah, exactly.
protocols, and they were using that intermediary was, I think, Cambodian bank,
Okay.
which was then deciphering those accounts to India, and India does not use ISO 2022 protocols, to my knowledge, in my humble experience working there. So, how does one facilitate these transactions and?
I mean, it would probably be better in that case, I guess it's not a SWIFT member bank, to figure out, to either specify the account details in the contract, and then the payor will have to figure out how to get it from the Cambodian bank to India.
Okay,
But
right.
to specify the payment details in the contract, and then the payor will have to figure out how to meet those.
Okay, Gaurav. Thank you so much for this.
Yeah. Hey.
Hello. It's because I got confused when you explained about the IOU and the discounts. Like, how is that?
So in other words, basically, if I give you an IOU that says I will pay you $100 in a year,
Thank you. Okay.
yeah. But if you want to sell that to somebody else, they're probably not going to give you full face value.
Because it has my
But-
name.
Well, no, because it's for a year from now, and who knows what's going to happen to me in a year's time. So the risk is that something
happen.
exactly, and so you will not get the full face value. They will give you a discount, something less than face value.
Okay, so I'm selling in advance.
Exactly. You're trying to transfer my future obligation to pay into cash now.
Into cash, right?
Into cash now, or however you want it. Clearly, you want money, or you want to trade it for something now. And so, then the discount is what someone will actually give you, as opposed to what the face value is. Because the
Okay.
risk is the time element. That you don't know, in a year, will I be able to pay it? Or will there be inflation? There are a variety of reasons, but the end result is you'd almost never be able to sell a future payment obligation for full face value.
Future payment obligation,
Yeah.
that's it.
That's the key,
Okay.
because it's a promise to pay in the future.
Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah. Hey.
Had a quick question
Yeah, yeah.
regarding IoT.
Yeah.
I'm a bit confused on how they're able to be transferred.
So an IOU isn't necessarily transferable, though they often are in practice. So if you want it to be effectively legally transferred, that would take you into specifications like for a bill of exchange. A bill of exchange says that if you do it in this way, it will be transferred. Whereas an IOU, without that, generally speaking, it will be transferable. But it's largely up to the buyer whether they're willing to accept it. So essentially, the bill of exchange mechanism says that if you meet these requirements, it is transferable. But an IOU, it's transferable if someone is willing to accept it.
Right, so it's on the buyer, the initial buyer to
Exactly.
accept that.
Exactly. So
And
in
then
many
would
ways,
that IOU be amended to reflect?
so it depends on how it's written. In other words, it could be to a specific person, or it could be in the context of say, promissory note or bill of exchange. It could generally say to pay the bearer of this, or it could just be blank. In other words, you could actually have an IOU. I give you an IOU, but I leave it blank, and you can fill in your name, or you can sell it to someone else, in which case they could fill in their name. So
Is that kind of like when you're giving a check to someone?
it is. But once again, and so a check, once again, it depends on, in many jurisdictions, a check won't necessarily be transferable. But under, say, Bill of Exchange rules in general, it would be transferable. So in other words, if it's written to someone, the person can sign it and then pass it to someone else. And then they would sign underneath, etc., until it was eventually paid. And so the Bill of Exchange mechanism is basically a legal mechanism to give legal predictability around transferability of an IOU. Yeah, but you can have an IOU is going to be transferable if the buyer is willing to take it. Yeah. Right. All right. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So, if we're thinking about evolution of payment systems, we've talked about the monetary aspect. We've talked around the transfer mechanism, your sort of correspondent banking network, your single provider, etc. We've just seen how, once again, the evolution of promissory notes frequently are used throughout the history of payments in the commercial context. We've just looked at that most recent example in the context of China. A bill of exchange is often something related, but effectively a bill of exchange is a standardized instrument that makes it easily transferable amongst different parties. In other words, it gives you a standard legal mechanism that ensures the transferability in a way that a promissory note doesn't necessarily have. A check is generally a form of a bill of exchange, though we do see in some jurisdictions limitations on transferability. But where those don't exist, the check as a form of bill of exchange is freely transferable across parties. We'll see the letter of credit example in just a few minutes, but I wanted to wrap up the Chinese story because they, in addition to the impact of new technologies, also are showing the evolution of a new instrument. So, the regulatory offensive's main weapon is document number 77, a policy document issued in April 2025 by 6 government departments led by the central bank. For the first time, it brought the sprawling market under a regulatory framework. The document classified the platforms that issue these IOUs as a new term: supply chain information service institutions. So, basically saying that the platform is separate from the provider, and that the activity of providing the platform is a regulated activity. Document number 77 explicitly barred platforms like BYD's Dalian from engaging in financial businesses unless they obtain a license. Instead, their work should focus on managing information. In other words, if you think about the system, one aspect of the system is managing orders, it's managing suppliers, it's managing buyers and sellers, so that both buyers and sellers can easily keep track of transactions, and also BYD, as the center point in the system, can keep track of its supply chain. But if one wants to add in the payment mechanism, that is now separate from this system. The model involves platforms acting as pure information conduits using verified transaction data to help banks assess the credit of small suppliers on their own merits. This decouples the financing from a complete reliance on the big company's credit. In other words, the idea is that instead of having the IOUs issued by the core company, the platform will keep track of orders, and that information can be shared with banks who can use the order books as a means to take credit decisions and also track transactions via the platform. The new regime imposes a 2-year transition period which began on June 15, 2025. Platforms must undergo a rectification process and apply for registration. Without it, they have to get out of the business. However, putting this model into wider practice faces major hurdles. The first is data itself. Unlike consumer e-commerce, where every step is logged, business-to-business trade data is often trapped in separate systems or on paper. Even highly digitized big companies are reluctant to share sensitive transaction data, citing commercial secrecy. Banks have also struggled to adapt. Traditional credit analysis based on financial statements is ill-suited for the small, non-standard, frequent transactions that make up supply chain finance. And next week, when we're turning more to supply chain finance, we're going to see a number of initiatives around various forms of standardization mechanisms to make it easier to provide financing in the supply chain context. The Chinese approach, and this is one where it's just getting started, so it's going to be very interesting to see how this evolves. In place of the murky IOU market, regulators are promoting a standardized alternative, what is called the supply chain bill. Launched by the Shanghai Commercial Paper Exchange in 2020, these instruments are regulated, legally protected electronic bills. In other words, instead of BYD having its own system, BYD would be able to issue IOUs, bills of exchange, via the Shanghai Commercial Paper Exchange. So in other words, if you're a BYD supplier, the terms of payment could say that you will be paid by a bill issued on the Shanghai Commercial Paper Exchange in a certain amount. That exchange then provides a mechanism for buying and selling those bills. So in other words, you could hold the bill until final payment, or you would have a mechanism to sell that bill via the system. These instruments are regulated, legally protected electronic bills. While still backed by a core enterprise's credit, they can be digitally split and transferred on a transparent, centralized system, solving many of the risks that come with proprietary IPOs. Adoption, however, has been slow. Total issuance is only in the hundreds of billions of yuan, a fraction of the private market, and only 45 supply chain platforms had connected to the exchange's system as of July. Nonetheless, the regulatory tide is turning. Supply chain finance platform CloudChain Group, facing compliance pressure as it seeks an overseas IPO, has begun aggressively pushing supply chain bills. We used to only do electronic certificates, but now we have to expand into supply chain bills. The volume of certificates has likely peaked. So what you see here is in the way that in many cases you start with a private platform, you then see the movement of that private platform into the context of a public exchange with standardized contracts for those payment instruments. Take up still at an early stage, so it's going to be interesting to see how this develops. But what has been interesting is to see over the past several years just how big the IOU market on the closed platforms became. Literally hundreds of billions of dollars outstanding at any given point in time on these platforms. And as we see the firms continue to internationalize, this mechanism, both the record, the information platform, but also the ability to link to the bills exchange, provides an interesting example. All right. To letters of credit. And if we look at a letter of credit is a mechanism to essentially address time, distance, and risk in the context of a payment transaction. So I want to look at basic structure. Basic structure, you have a buyer and a seller of a good. So this could be something under our Convention on International Contracts for the Sale of Goods. One of our terms is a payment term. Now we've seen that one aspect will be currency, another aspect will be timing, a third will be payment mechanism. Very common mechanism which has developed really since at least the 13th century has been the development of what is called the letter of credit. The letter of credit essentially adds in separate parties for the payment and tries to deal with the fact that the delivery of the goods may take a certain amount of time. So you would have the buyer of the goods from the seller. Second contract is an agreement with the bank that issues the letter of credit. That letter of credit is issued for the benefit of the seller. In other words, the bank of the buyer issues a contract that it will pay the seller upon what we're going to see, delivery of documents. So in essence, the seller has to arrange delivery of documents to the issuing bank. Payment will go via the bank of the seller, delivering to the bank of the buyer, and eventually paying the seller. So if we look at contract of sale, the underlying contract of sale specifies method and time of payments and documents to be tendered. Very frequently, at the core of the letter of credit is this idea of presentment of documents. In other words, the issuing bank will only pay on the basis of receipt of certain documents. Now, that essentially separates the payment obligation from the buyer and seller and makes it an independent obligation by the issuing bank, which is then a trust intermediary, which will deliver on the basis of preset documents. Contract between the buyer and the issuing bank. The issuing bank must strictly follow the instructions of the applicant when opening a credit. The letter of credit must comply with the contract of sale. Contract between the issuing bank and the confirming bank. The contract between the issuing bank and the confirming bank is a contract of agency. When asked to confirm the letter of credit, AB, the confirming bank, acts in dual capacity. With respect to the advising, it is the issuing bank's agent. With respect to the confirmation of the letter of credit, the bank acts as a correspondent bank, which means it gives its own payment undertaking to the beneficiary as principal. And 4 and 5 are contracts between the banks and the seller. Yeah. So, let's see. Basically, key idea is this. First is, oh, sorry, wrong button. Contract for buying and selling between the buyer and the seller. So seller agrees to sell something to the buyer agrees to pay at the point that the seller delivers. But in order to do that, the buyer engages a bank which agrees to make a payment to the seller via the confirming bank on the presentation by the seller of documentation that shows that the seller has met its obligations. So in other words, the basic idea of the letter of credit is the buyer only wants to pay once the seller has delivered at a certain stage. Often the delivery isn't necessarily that it arrives actually with the buyer. It's often to the point that it is put onto a ship or other means of acceptable transport, that it has left the control of the seller and is on its way to the buyer. So in other words, the buyer doesn't want to pay before it knows the goods are coming. The seller doesn't want to ship the goods before it's been paid. And so the letter of credit is a mechanism so that you stick the banks in between so that both can get what they're looking for. In other words, the buyer has an assurance that it's only paying after the goods are on their way. The seller has assurance that once the goods are on the way, it will be paid. And so we talked in one of the tutorial groups last week about the escrow agent. In this case, it's not an escrow agent. You've actually engaged a bank as a separate party to the transaction. And in this case, you've basically removed the buyer and seller from the standpoint of payment risk. The payment is going from the issuing bank to the confirming bank. The idea is that the banks should be trustworthy if they've been selected in an appropriate way, and that the transaction is based purely on a list of documents which have been included, typically in the contract for purchase and sale, and then mirrored in the letter of credit. So that the letter of credit is a separate arrangement from the underlying contract, but it's connected with that. And so the bank will only make the payment on presentation of documents. Doesn't really care about anything else. The banks want to make this as easy and low cost for them as possible. Because usually the issuance of a letter of credit isn't a high margin business for a bank. Rather, it's a commodity business. They want to be able to do large numbers of these. And very frequently, as we'll see next week when we're looking at supply chain finance, very frequently, once again, you have a small number of banks like HSBC, Standard Chartered, BNP Paribas, Bank of China, Citi, this relatively small group of banks that tends to be most heavily involved in the context of letters of credit and trade finance. So you have a small number of banks that do lots and lots of these for relatively small amounts of money, but they make it worth their time because they've standardized the process to a very high level, and they do lots of them. And the lots of them means that they have a fair amount of information about parties, the buyers and sellers in particular, and a good idea about the credit worthiness of the buyers and sellers involved. And there's also, if you will, a portfolio effect. If you do tens of thousands of transactions, the fact that the risk of each transaction may be relatively high, but across tens of thousands of those transactions, you end up with a lower level of predictable risk. And so letters of credit tend to be a scale business where a small number of banks tend to dominate from the standpoint of issuance. Confirmation may vary to a greater extent, though in many cases it may be a related business. So let's come at this from a different direction. So if we look at the letter of credit, it's very common payment mechanism in the context of international sales of goods where you have a time and distance element. In other words, if you have an instantaneous transaction, there's not really a need for a letter of credit. There is that delivery. But to the extent that there is a time element in between something being ordered and something being delivered, and the ability to work out an arrangement where the buyer is able to have some assurance that the thing is being delivered, and the seller has some assurance that the buyer is paying, it has emerged as a very useful transactional arrangement. It's become sufficiently useful that the ICC has developed a standardized set of practices, what is called the UCP, Uniform Customs and Practices. Most recent edition is 600, for what are called documentary credits, which are effectively letters of credit. If we look at the ICC website, we can find that parties involved, essentially to be aware that the parties involved in the documentary credit transaction, a brief summary of follows. Applicant, the party on whose request the credit is issued, normally the buyer. Issuing bank, the bank that issues a credit at the request of the applicant. Advising bank, the bank that advises the credit. At the request of the issuing bank. Confirming bank, the bank that adds its undertaking to a credit in addition to that of the issuing bank to honor or negotiate a complying transaction. Nominated bank is the bank with which the credit is available, or any bank in case it is available with any bank. The beneficiary is the party in whose favor the credit is issued, and normally the provider of goods. And so the package basically provides one with a standardized contract, but also a series of terms that go with it. And so very frequent to have in your contract for the sale of goods that payment will be via a letter of credit governed by UCP 600. But that will then be separate contracts between the bank and the seller, the bank and the seller's bank, and between the buyer and the confirming bank. So in other words, to delay or to have the payment separated in terms of time and distance, one adds in 2 extra parties and at least 3 extra contracts beyond the terms that are in the contract for sale of goods itself. Now, this is not a convention, it's a set of customs and practices. So trade usage, but a trade usage that has become very heavily embedded and accepted in the industry as a way to enhance predictability and reduce transaction costs. In addition to the rules and guidelines, there are a series of guidance papers around specific issues, including principle, which will come to strict compliance, use of drafts, documentary credit format. We also have an e-UCP. This is designed to be able to use a digital version. And the digital version of a letter of credit seems to be reasonably workable. The key, however, is in the context of the documents that are presented as going with that. But it has to be said that even today there is a very heavy usage of paper-based letters of credit because that structure is very familiar and standardized in the industry and by the issuing banks. And so the take-up of the electronic version has so far not been high. Not like an e-bill of lading where there are legal issues, but really more because the level of familiarity with the paper-based systems is so high that it's difficult to dislodge those systems with electronic versions. The idea is that it is secure from the standpoint of both buyer and seller. It adds in the separate, trusted third party. It does have the potential risk of some problem with the bank, but that's not something that we really take too much focus in this course. Generally speaking, the default is that these letters of credit are irrevocable. In other words, once the seller engages the contract, they can't cancel it unilaterally. It's something that once it is set, it's set, and this then allows the buyer to rely on it, but also the confirming bank to rely on the system. One can also use, from the standpoint of financing, the idea that the expectation of getting paid on the letter of credit may be a sufficient means to access credit from one of the 2 banks in the context of the transaction while the transaction is pending. We want to think about sort of key pieces. Kind of the key pieces that always come out is, one, this idea of the documentary character of the letter of credit. In other words, this idea that payment is on the basis of documents. So this idea that the letter of credit is autonomous from the transaction. The key to the banks is to make it as cheap and easy as possible to administer. So the banks don't want to hear about whatever really happens in the transaction. The banks simply say payment will take place on presentation of the necessary documents. And unless there is some fraud in the context of those documents that the bank should observe, then the payment should be automatic. This is the key to the transaction. It's separate from the real transaction, and it's made to be as automatic as possible, which does sort of highlight that in some ways, if it's meant to be as automatic as possible, then we should be able to, in some way, automate the transaction. And usually that is possible, but because of the nature of the presentment of documents and the liability concerned, we typically don't have full automation embedded in these transactions, though the structure is to be as automatic as possible. When payment is made by a documentary credit, buyer must open a credit of the correct type and do so in good time. So in other words, you will have under the contract of sale your payment term, if it involves a letter of credit, that is a contractual term. And we saw in the CISG that one would expect to have a payment term in that contract. Very frequently would be to have payment via confirmed letter of credit in a certain currency on the presentation of certain types of documents. The obligation to open a credit is generally seen as enforceable, and the opening of the credit will operate as conditional payment. In other words, once it's been opened, that is irrevocable. The obligation to make the payment is irrevocable, though the payment will only take place on the basis of the presentation of the required documents, which one would expect to be both listed in the context of the contract for sale of goods, but then mirrored in the contract for the letter of credit. Typically, the seller, the beneficiary of the letter of credit, must present a commercial invoice identifying the goods, a bill of lading identifying transport and title, though of course this will vary depending upon the shipping mechanism chosen, an insurance certificate to show insurance coverage, and other certificates as required to identify the specifications for the contract. The UCP sets out specific requirements with regard to particular documents in Articles 17 to 28. So the issuing bank has the obligation to pay upon compliant presentation of documents. So the basic idea is if you are the seller of the goods, in order to get paid under the letter of credit, you will need to present the required documents to the confirming bank. Confirming bank will look and say, right, you have a commercial invoice, this seems to match. You have a bill of lading that seems to match the commercial invoice. You have an insurance certificate that matches, and you have documentation, certification that the goods have met whatever other quality controls. If those things are checked off, the confirming bank will say, documents are confirmed, the issuing bank should be triggered to make the payment. Yeah?
Please correct me if I'm wrong, but is an unconditional letter of credit means that there should be documents for the payment to be released?
So an unconditional letter of credit means essentially that it is on the documents. It's unconditional in that the documents have to be met. So, here, let me pull this up. So, unconditional is basically what we're talking about. In other words, it must be paid on the presentation of the documents. So that's the key, is it's not conditional, it's unconditional, because it will be paid as soon as they're presented. So the conditional one may add in certain conditions, but banks don't like them because it makes them do extra stuff. There may be, yeah. So you could add in other things, but the banks generally don't want you to add in anything because the margins are thin and they want to do as little as possible. Yeah. And, so we'll come back to it. Yeah. Okay, so we've looked at the contracts. We've looked at the typical payment terms, looked at the stages. Issuing bank, essentially, to the applicant is the issue of credit, examination of the document. If the documents match, payment. And largely, when we're thinking about that, that's largely the focus of the bank. From the standpoint of the advising bank is largely from the standpoint of confirming or of advising that everything has been done properly. It is the agent of the issuing bank. The confirming bank is a separate undertaking. It confirms the documents and pays. Presentation is the issuing and confirming banks. You have expiry dates, presentation dates. Under precise instructions, the key here, and once again, the key is to assume in any letter of credit transaction that the banks are lazy. The banks want to do as little as possible. And so it effectively says that instructions must be complete and precise, must stipulate the documents against which payment is to be made. Banks will adhere strictly to terms. In other words, if whatever doesn't match precisely, the bank actually should not pay. There should be no sort of discretionary action. It's a simple matching. Does the document match what is required? If the document matches, the bank pays. If the document doesn't match, the bank should not pay. UCP, originally published in 1933, revised periodically, most recent version from 2007. And essentially, the 2007, the UCP 600, is generally the most widely used today. It's now been around long enough that there are not that many contracts that are still under the UCP 500. It is meant to be a bit shorter, a bit more concise, but this is the standard generally used. Articles 1 to 3, general definitions, 4 to 8 and 14 to 16, liability and responsibility of banks, examining presented documents, 9 to 11, form and notification of credits, 12 to 13, nominated banks, and Articles 17 to 28, requirements regarding particular documents. And the idea is that all credits are sight, accepted, negotiated, but payment can also be made on reserve if this is necessary. The application of UCP 600 only to irrevocable letters of credit. And this is a deviation from the previous rules. Certainly when I studied it, you could have, under the UCP 500, you could have revocable letters of credit. But the approach today is generally to have the default on the irrevocable letter of credit, which simplifies administration, ensures the automaticity of the transaction. UCP 600 tries to address some of the issues that arose under UCP 500 to increase effectiveness. Notable differences: 600 is shorter, a new section providing definition, certain slightly ambiguous terms replaced by more specific terms, so eliminating reasonable time and replacing with a definite number of days for document examination. More comprehensive treatment of the original documents, and, as I mentioned, the presumption that one is looking at irrevocable credits unless clearly stated to the contrary. Article 17, original documents and copies, includes a new clause which states that at least one original of each document stipulated in the credit must be presented. However, a document bearing the word original is deemed to be an original. This is one of those things where historically there was an assumption that many of these documents were singular in nature. There was one invoice, there was one bill of lading. But in reality, in many transactions, you actually have multiple copies. And so you will have carbon copies effectively of certain documents, and the ability to use those in the context of presentment, provided that they are labeled as original, even if they are not necessarily singular and unique. Changes in transport documents, no longer including the word clean, even if the credit requires the transport document evidence clean on board. Bill of lading means port to port, which when we come to transport documents and standard transport terms, we'll look at these different terms in the context of transport. And once again, you will have in your sale of goods contract, you'll have terms referring to transport, separate contracts for the transport. Those transport contracts must be mirrored or reflected in the documents required under the letter of credit in order for it to work. In other words, there's a fair amount in the context of each of these transactions, even if one is reusing a specimen document, the need to make sure that it has been corrected to match the facts of the specific individual transaction in order to make sure that it works. Yep. That. Key point on irrevocable. Irrevocable letter of credit cannot be canceled or modified. Seller is entitled to payment if he presents the correct documents to the bank within the contractual period. And this is a really key point. What it means is that once the contract for the letter of credit is entered into, that meets the payment obligation. It is up to the seller to make sure that the documents necessary to get the payment to actually take place are achieved. Confirmed versus unconfirmed letter of credit. Effectively, A confirmed letter of credit is a mechanism to add an additional level of trust to a transaction. In other words, there may be concerns about one or more of the banks, and adding in a confirming bank will often be a bank name that is well known and trustworthy in international markets to make the transaction safer and more secure. A credit is confirmed when the corresponding bank, in addition to advising the seller of the letter of credit, adds its own confirmation to the credit. It becomes a liability of the confirming bank and gives the right to the seller to pursue the confirming bank for payment if, for whatever reason, payment is not made on the basis of the documents presented. Standby letters of credit are basically a separate system. A standby letter of credit is a different type of credit, which we'll look at later. The key when we're looking at documentary credits, and in particular irrevocable letters of credit under UCP 600, is this idea that this is effectively a payment mechanism. In other words, it's not really about financing. It's about making sure that payment addresses time and distance in the transaction. It can be used for financing, but it's not a guarantee, it's not a financing mechanism. This is simply payment so that the payment takes place when the goods have met required delivery conditions. Buyer has confirmed payment at the beginning of the transaction. Seller has a right to receive the payment on meeting the obligations in the credit. So the key is a letter of credit is very much a payment transaction. Revolving letters of credit. Yep. Good. So back to these fundamental principles, and these are the ones that one always needs to come back to. This idea that the letter of credit is independent, and that it is independent on the basis of strict compliance. We think of documentary character. That key point, banks are lazy. Banks deal with documents and not with goods, service, or performance to which the documents relate. It's only about the presentation of documents. Banks have no responsibility for anything other than conformity of the documents to the credit. And of course, that does require a standard of examination, that the examination of the presentation on the basis of the documents alone. So in other words, key to this, and I know it seems repetitive, but the key to this is that the banks just pay on the documents. They want nothing to do with the underlying transaction. The key to this for the bank is to make it as simple as possible. And then from the standpoint of the buyer and seller, it is as dependable as possible. Strict compliance. Basically, the documents have to match. And so one should have sufficient specificity in the contract in order to make sure that the letter of credit actually matches the terms of the contract. Because at the end of the day, the banks do not care about the reality of the underlying transaction. The transaction for the bank is to pay on the basis of presentation of documents. Now, from the standpoint of the bank, it's going to charge a fee for this, and there is a question in terms of the payment itself. is the payment simply being extracted from the account of the buyer, or is there an element of credit being provided by the bank to the buyer? But once again, the credit aspect is separate from the payment aspect. This is simply a mechanism to make sure that payment takes place once the goods are on their way. Exceptions to strict compliance. Basically, there are a few exceptions, and largely there are small errors where one can still say that the match is close enough. But in every case, banks will try to only pay on exact presentation. Banks have a certain duty in the context of examination, and basically the key here is that the documents are actually compliant. In other words, the key for the bank is to make sure that the documents presented actually comply with the requirements. Because if the bank actually pays on non-compliant documents, then it is potentially liable to the buyer for improper payment. In other words, the contract between the bank and the buyer is to pay only on the basis of documents. So if a bank pays beyond those requirements, then the seller actually is likely to have a good argument that in fact the bank paid improperly. The contract from the standpoint of the bank was to pay on presentation of conforming documents. Reimbursement. There are damages in some cases if a bank delays from the standpoint of payment. In some cases, payment doesn't take place and it should have. In other cases, payment does take place and it shouldn't have. And in both cases, one can expect the possibility of damages from the bank for those respective delays. Autonomy, same point. The letter of credit has a life of its own. To instill faith in the mechanism, it must be honored regardless of any problems with the underlying transaction. And this is largely the principles that are embedded in the context of the UCP 600, so that the legal positions for all of the parties are very clear. The, if you will, the operation is clear, straightforward, and at lowest possible cost to everybody involved. There's only one case, and that is that there could be the possibility of fraud. Generally speaking, fraud is something that banks will try to avoid looking into. But at the same time, if something is obviously fraudulent, the expectation is that the bank should act accordingly. In other words, banks where they believe quite obviously that there is fraud shouldn't support that. And therefore, that is the expectation. These could be on the basis of knowledge, they could be on the basis of a variety of sorts of provision of information, etc. And the fraud exception is generally meant to be quite limited, because once again, you don't want the bank investigating. The role of the bank is simply to take the documents and to pay, but if there is something where the fraud is very obvious, then the bank should, in fact, pay. Nature of the bank's duty from documents, regularity of documents, basically how they appear on their face, reasonable care and compliance by international standard banking practice as reflected in the UCP 600. Basically, the whole idea is that the bank is not concerned with anything, over and over, except the documentary conditions of the transactions. We've seen in some cases this idea that certain levels of errors in names, etc., are not going to necessarily bar a transaction, but in many cases, best practice from the banks, unless something matches precisely, will be to reject and send the seller back to get conforming documents rather than investigate variances between required documents and those that are presented. Yep, we've got applicable law. Generally, you will have a choice of law clause in the context of the letter of credit. And very frequently, you will find your major financial jurisdictions, English law, New York law, Singaporean law, these are very frequently used in the context of these sorts of transactions. They also match the jurisdictions of the leading banks involved from the standpoint of actually issuing the letters of credit. And in each case, clear support for enforcement of the terms of the UCP on a very strict basis by those courts. One last piece from the standpoint of this idea of choice of form for international commercial law. If you think about this idea, this is not a convention, it's not necessarily a standard contract, though we did see that the ICC does have standard contracts. These are uniform customs and practices. So in other words, these are basically, in most cases, standards and rules which highlight in each case how the system will operate in order to give maximum predictability to the parties. Probably the best proof from the standpoint of whether it's worked or not has been the idea that it has, in fact, for a long period of time, been generally adopted as the most common practice in international commerce for the majority of transactions for a very long period of time. But if we think about some of the technological changes that we're seeing, we can see that certain mechanisms, like the structure we just saw from the BYD model, or the bills exchange in the context of the Chinese structure, that these new technological changes are allowing us to achieve some of the same functions via different means. And it's interesting that in the context of particularly large supply headers like BYD or Apple, the frequency of use of their own centralized online systems has dramatically increased. The letter of credit mechanism we find more often in one-off transactions or in the context of large bulk shipments which are going via sea. So we see, if you will, some areas where historically we might have used letters of credit, other forms of payment structures emerging. And that's more or less where we'll pick up next week, is as we move from that sort of line, which I've tried to keep to tonight, between payment and financing. Next week, we'll move from payment into the financing side. All right. Questions, comments on anything? Yeah, please. So basically, historically, earlier editions of the UCP would more or less try to support both revocable and irrevocable letters of credit. The idea of the revocable letter of credit is that once it's been authorized by the seller, it may possibly be revocable under certain circumstances. UCP 600, because there were lots of headaches with the revocable credit, just moved to irrevocable credits. And so the assumption is that it's an irrevocable credit unless you've decided for some specific reason to choose a revocable letter of credit, which is then not addressed by the UCP 600 because each one, why you would have it, is very fact specific. So assume in most cases that unless it's specifically stated, otherwise, if something is governed by the UCP 600, it will be an irrevocable letter of credit. And that's really the industry preference, because as a seller, you want to know that once you've met your obligations, the payment will turn up. Yeah. Say again? It's not really a bank guarantee. It's really, and we'll look a bit at bank guarantees later. But a guarantee in most cases is that someone is going to do something and the bank guarantees it will happen. But in this case, the bank's actually making the payment. So it's not guaranteeing anything. The bank is actually making a payment. It's doing a service that it has contracted with the buyer to make a payment. But it will only make that payment if the documents are presented. So it's not a guarantee. This is actually a contractual obligation by the bank to make a payment on presentment of documents. Irrelevant. Irrelevant. Yeah. That's the key to the autonomy principle, is that as long as the documents meet the requirements, bank pays. So if basically, a lot will depend on the factual situation, who owes who what. But for instance, let's say the buyer has delivered the goods to the shipping company has shipped the goods, there's been a storm and the ship sank. That's why you have insurance. Exactly. So the buyer gets paid because they've delivered to the ship. The ship, once the buyer delivers to the ship, they're done. But then you need the insurance term to cover if something happens. But yeah, it's always, if you have some circumstance where the documents are presented, payment is made, but for whatever reason, the goods haven't actually arrived, you end up with a very fact-specific context. So basically, the confirming bank is more of a guarantee. It's guaranteeing the other banks. So for instance, It may well be the case that I've asked my bank, which is, the Bank of Missouri, to provide the letter of credit, but you don't really trust them. You've never heard of them. And so you actually want a confirmation from a bank you've heard of. JP Morgan confirms, and then you don't have to care that Bank of Missouri, nobody's ever heard of them, because JP Morgan confirms, and if Bank of Missouri, something happens to them, JP Morgan pays. Exactly. The confirmer has to pay. Yeah. But in many cases, the default is just to go for JP Morgan or Standard Chartered in the first place, and then you don't need the extra level. Trust. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Because if you're the seller and I've told you Bank of Missouri is going to pay you, you're like, I don't even know where that is. And so, but if you say, all right, we'll take JP Morgan, okay, you know that. Hey. So you should, and so this is, I didn't go into the depth of it, but the UCP, you would expect in the context of the actual letter of credit that you would have a choice of law. Generally, the bank will choose the law, its law. So in other words, if you use Standard Chartered, you're probably going to get English law or Hong Kong law or Singapore law. Yeah. So if you use Bank of America, you're likely to get New York law. So often the bank will choose the legal system that it's most comfortable with. And
If I understand correctly, we have a contract and use a letter of credit, and then to use that letter of credit, we will use the
Exactly.
600, which
Exactly.
is voluntary, right? And those are like kind of terms that will regulate the use of that letter of credit. And that contract will be managed by the law that the bank decides.
So generally, that would be the expectation. Generally, when the buyer asks the bank to arrange a letter of credit, the bank will agree, and then the bank's standard terms would typically have the choice of law that the bank likes, because they're providing the service. And so that would be the typical approach.
So the bank can refuse to?
Well, so the bank, you can ask the bank for a letter of credit, and it can say no.
Okay.
I mean, it's a service, it's charging. Banks frequently do. They'll come in and they'll say, I want to arrange, and they say, no, your credit isn't good enough, you don't have enough money, we've never heard of you, all of these things. So generally, if, for instance, the bank will typically use its standardized documentation because it's the provider of the letter of credit. And typically, the bank's standardized documentation will use the choice of law that the bank is most comfortable with.
The parties need to agree to the bank's decision on the law.
You can, if you are a very big buyer, you may be able to object to the bank, and the bank may say, but most of the time the bank is just going to say, the choice of law is something that is part of us providing the service, and it's a standard term, non-negotiable.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify when you were discussing sweets. Yeah, I know that you mentioned sweets doesn't mean
Yeah.
just there to give instructions.
Right.
What I have confusion about is when you were trying to explain how that transaction is sweet based instruction.
Yeah.
How that transaction, for instance, someone is in Hong Kong wants to buy something for someone in the United States of America. So when you're explaining something like the money will move and I thought
Yeah, so I'll probably do this again, but let me just sort of, the basic idea is that US dollars go via essentially the US payment system. So if you're paying US dollars, generally speaking, the expectation is that somewhere in the way it's going to go via the US dollar payment system, which typically means that there's going to be two banks that have accounts in that system. So let's say that you have HSBC on one side, Standard Chartered on the other. HSBC in Hong Kong, and then you have, let's say, Nubank in Brazil. So I want to make a payment from Hong Kong to Brazil in US dollars. SWIFT is a communications mechanism that basically says, I am going to transfer from Hong Kong to Nubank, and these are the account details. So it's to flag to Nubank that the transaction is happening, and when it arrives, where to put it. So the actual route is the Hong Kong dollars will be sold to buy US dollars, which will then be credited to HSBC's account in New York. Standard Chartered has a US dollar account in New York. The transaction will then be credited to Standard Chartered New York, debited from HSBC New York. Standard Chartered will then credit Nubank's account in Brazil in US dollars, and then those US dollars will have to be sold to buy Brazilian real. So it's actually, instead of, well, it is, but it's also the fact that instead of, the money isn't actually moving from one place to another. It's accounts in different places are being debited and then credited. And so it's different if we make a cash payment where we actually hand over the cash, that's an actual transfer. Or something like Bitcoin, where it literally does, it literally does move from place to place. But when we're talking about the sort of bank-based payment system, it really is debiting one account, crediting another account, and
Okay, so when you mentioned Hong Kong dollars, is it like their own? I was thinking if their own dollars is different or something.
it's a separate
And
currency.
of course, the USD will be higher.
In this case. So you could have examples where some other currency is higher, but in this case, the Hong Kong dollar is about 8 Hong Kong dollars to the US dollar. So, but either way, if you're starting in Hong Kong dollars, you would have to sell the Hong Kong dollars to buy the US dollars.
Yes, okay. So basically, the banks will do it for you once SWIFT gives the instruction.
Exactly. Well, it's actually, you give the bank the instruction, and then the bank tells Nubank that this is happening. And so Nubank then, when it eventually gets this credit, knows who it goes to. Yeah.
Our next tutorial, next Friday, right? Or this Friday? Because I haven't seen it in my calendar.
I think it's a couple of weeks away. I think it's after the March break.
So we'll not have our tutorial this Friday.
It's not every week.
Okay.
No, it's only, we only have.
Every 2 weeks. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much.
But every 2 weeks would be the week after the reading. So,
Perfect. Thank you.
yeah. Oh, let me check and see. I can't remember. I honestly can't remember. Some of these I can easily get, and some I can't. So let me check, and if I can, then I'll circulate it. Yeah. If I can't, then I can't. Yeah. Oh, yeah, no problem. It's, here. Yeah. Hey.
So my question is, if there were a question related to, I don't know how to answer the question, but this whole topic on payment, yes, is it like a question that can come up in the assessment? And if it were, would it come up like just payment on its own, or would it be like with something else?
Probably if I were to do something on payments, it would be around sort of changing dynamics of payments, something like that. I wouldn't sort of put payments and financing together, and I probably won't do any fact-based questions. They'll be sort of essay-based. So, yeah, you're welcome.